speaker for today. Today's a bit of a bonus colloquium. It was going to sort of be, last week was going to be the end, and then we managed to add on a week. So thanks to David Shaw and the colloquium committee for allowing us to do that. So absolute pleasure today for me to invite Dr. Jeremy Hogeveen, who's going to be our final colloquium speaker of the year, and it's even more of a pleasure because Jeremy is actually my former PhD student from back in the day. So I'll give you a little bit. I can't tell you all the juicy gossip about it, but I'll give you a little bit. We met. I want to say it was like 2007, 8 maybe.
I think 2009.
8, 9.
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Years just running through each other. So Jeremy was in my undergraduate seminar in cognition, and there was this guy, and he was like sort of head and shoulders above the other students. So I approached him kind of towards the end of the term, and I said, have you thought about grad school? And his answer was, no, I've got a really bad GPA. And I was like, what is it? He said, I think I'm somewhere like a B average or something. I was like, you know what? Come do a master's in my lab, right? So Jeremy came, did a master's with me. I think you were an RA first for a bit, and then did a master's. And then he was doing really well, and he threatened to he was going. This is when I was at Laurier, I should add, back in the day. He was doing really well, and he decided he was going to go to NYU for his PhD. And of course, we usually say to students, oh, you know, it's good to go out and get like a broad range. And I was like, no, don't go to NYU, stay at Laurier. And we work so well together, and you're going to love it. And anyway, a lot of bribery involved, and I managed to get him to stay in the lab at Laurier. So he did his PhD with me there, and you know, I'd say I was counting recently. 10 papers in his PhD, 2 Journal of Neuroscience papers, 1 JEP general paper, right, amongst many other really great. So it wasn't a mistake.
No, it worked out.
So he left my lab, and then was lucky enough to get a really good postdoc position at Northwestern, working with Jordan Grafman on brain injury. And then after that, was that 2 years? Was that 2 years in Chicago. And then after that, went across to UC Davis, to the Mind Institute, and worked with Marjorie Solomon and Cam Carter on autism, and picked up a lot of new skills outside, you know, in those postdoctoral experiences around imaging, and I think some computational stuff as well over the years. And then he got a faculty position at University of New Mexico a few years ago, 2018. Look at this, paperless intro, got it all.
Good memory.
2018. At University of New Mexico in psychology, where he is now, and he's now a tenured professor associate professor, I should say, at New Mexico, doing really well, getting really great results with grants. He's got himself an R01, which is not easy to do, an NSF Career Award, which is also not easy to do. So really proud of where Jeremy's got to, and super happy to have him here. I'll stop there and let him tell you about what he's been up to.
Thank you, sir. It's all thanks to good mentorship. That's what. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I know this is a little outside of the normal colloquium schedule, so I appreciate you all being here. I realized I accidentally plagiarized the punk rock reference in my title from John Cohen, a paper he wrote a long time ago called Should I Stay or Should I Go? I didn't mean to, but it was in there. Now it's out. It's just exploration and exploitation and motivated choice. So I'm at the University of New Mexico, and what I'm going to tell you a little bit about today is, first off, how I got to studying this topic. So I like to sort of start off with a little bit of a flavor for why I'm doing the thing that I'm doing with my lab. I'll then kind of tell 3 stories. So at lunch, talking to Suk, I was reminded of how well he set me up to have these really nice presentations that will flow seamlessly from one to another, and then I come back and I'm actually kind of tell 3 truncated stories, just to kind of give you a flavor for a few different lines of work we're doing. One kind of on basic mechanisms, one on the relevance of the mechanisms we study to patients with brain injury in particular, but some other patient groups we're looking into now as well that I'll mention. And then the last one that I've gotten really obsessed with recently, probably somewhat correlated with around the time I had children, is neurodevelopment, and in particular adolescent neurodevelopment, which we're super interested in now. So those are kind of going to be three sort of short stories as we go through the talk. So my path to studying this explore-exploit decision-making question really came from my time as a postdoc in clinical settings. So I was a cognitive neuroscientist, but I had the benefit of being around a medical setting where you would see patients actually undergoing treatment for various brain disorders during both my postdocs. One of them was brain injury, so I would see people from receiving brain stimulation-based interventions to try to recover speech, to exoskeletons to help them move about the hallways and learn to walk again after an injury, all sorts of different interventions that they were undergoing treatment for. Then after a couple of years, I ended up, for a variety of reasons, deciding to move to another lab where we were studying autism spectrum disorder with neuroimaging methods, and saw a whole different set of patient variables there. So patients that were more or less engaged in the treatment, but always parents who were super engaged in the treatment. So they would really get the kids into the studies and get the kids there trying to see if they could benefit from clinical trials, et cetera. And when I started to see all these different clinical phenomena that arise in folks with brain disorders, it became really clear what kind of the special sauce is for who ends up having a really good functional outcome, whether it's neurodevelopment or an acquired injury later in life. It really ends up being the motivation either the patient has or their family member has, or there's some amount of motivation to get well or to function at your best after an injury or through some sort of idiopathic developed disorder that seems to predict who's going to do the best, so who's going to go on to live the most functionally improved life after a treatment. And it got me really interested in what's making that change person to person. So what is driving that motivational difference that's so predictive of the outcome? And it got me talking to Jordan Grafman a bit, who I was working with at the time, about what he sees in his brain injured patients. And he said, yes, indeed, that's something that they see in their brain injury patients all the time, is that apathy or acquired amotivation after an injury ends up being a huge predictor of functional outcomes. And so we started talking about how to study it with one another. And in order to do that, we kind of stole some methods that have been developed in the behavioral economics literature. So we did a study on value-based choice in traumatic brain injury, or TBI. Sorry, I always tell my students to spell out their acronyms first. I forgot to. Traumatic brain injury, aka TBI. So we wanted to study reward-based decision-making, or value-based choice in TBI. And the way that the paradigm we chose, which was from this really old paper from Becker, DeGroot, and Marshak back in the 60s, was to have participants do kind of an auction task for simple goods. So the goods were foods of various reinforcement values. So we had junk foods that people might be really motivated to get, and some less exciting foods like vegetables like spinach or celery, et cetera. And we had pictures of those stimuli, and we had our participants come in and just first off say, how much would you like to eat this? And they sort of rated that on a Likert scale from +7 all the way down to -7. And as they were performing this task, I mean, the simplest explanation for what might cause amotivation in a value system like this is maybe they just aren't seeing the potential pleasure that could come out of any of these stimuli. So maybe they just have a blunted ability to see how they might enjoy some sort of a stimulus later on. So even if it's a Butterfinger, which most people tend to like, maybe they can't anticipate any hedonic response to that, so they don't really care for it, and they give it a low rating. That's not at all what we see. So we see liking ratings with TBI and control here, and it's basically a straight line. So this is the mean and standard deviation of each of the items in the stimulus set. So both the spinach and the broccolis, but also the Butterfingers and the other junk foods. And you kind of see that controls and TBI participants are rating these items similarly favorably. It's not that they don't understand that they might like the stimulus. So that led us to deliver this auction paradigm as well in these individuals, where we actually had them bidding money, that we gave them an allotment to bid for these items, and we gave them between $0 and $3 and said, try your best to tell us the exact amount you'd be willing to pay for this item, somewhere between $0 and $3, with the idea that at the end of the study, we were going to randomly select an item and a value, and if they had bid more than that randomly selected item and value, they would get to eat the item. So or they would get to keep the $3. So you should, in that setup, kind of bid your exact willingness to pay for the item. We then measured how similar these two were. So in theory, if you really like Butterfingers, you should bid a lot. You should have a high willingness to pay for that item. If you really don't like Butterfingers, you should not bid very high for that item. So we should have a nice correlation between those two values. And we wanted to study this in patients that had lesions to a part of the brain that we think is important for stimulus valuation, in particular the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this was out of a Vietnam brain injury study cohort where we had hundreds of participants overall, well into the chronic phase post-injury, so like over 40 years post-injury doing the task. And what we wanted to see is, does damage to this part of your brain disrupt your motivation to go out and get those stimuli? And what we first off demonstrated was a nice replication of what's been found in the TBI literature, which is that these folks with lesions to this part of the brain were fairly apathetic. So this was actually a caregiver-reported measure of clinical apathy here on the y-axis. And we had the caregivers reporting higher levels of apathy in the patients that had lesions to this specific brain region. And this was back before everybody started hating mediation analysis, so we did a mediation analysis on it. And I think now people say this could be like 3 regressions hiding in a trench coat, so you're not supposed to do it anymore. But anyways, it worked at the time, so we published it. And what we found was that correlation between liking and bidding on those items during the value-based decision-making task was mediating this effect of VMPFC lesions on apathy, suggesting that some inability to consistently value the stimuli on that task was what was driving the increased apathy levels in these patients. Suggesting it wasn't necessarily just the hedonic anticipation or how much you were going to like to eat something, but something about the clarity or the consistency of that value-based decision-making signal that was perturbed in these patients and causing amotivation down the road because they had a hard time making value-based estimates. We replicated this and also sort of did some resting state connectivity in a follow-up study looking at the same area with closed head TBI later on. But both of these tasks, first off the behavioral economics task and resting state neuroimaging, are not the most computationally precise ways to look at this. So I was still kind of left with this, but what are they actually having a hard time getting motivated to do question. I didn't totally understand it yet. And the problem I sort of came to realize as I was setting out to open up my lab and choose what research questions I really wanted to go after was that auction task, and honestly pretty much every other way we've studied reward historically in the literature, are kind of blinded by this idea that motivation all comes from prior knowledge. So you have your sort of learned value of these Butterfinger treats. That's exactly what you're relying on to select whether or not you want that object. But in general, in life, we don't necessarily make entirely prior knowledge-based decisions. A lot of times we have uncertainty in the world, and we need to consider whether or not it would benefit us to try out something uncertain and potentially find a new, better alternative. And so this is something that humans and other primate organisms do particularly well. There's a few different species of birds that do it particularly well as well, but it's not necessarily a widely evolved ability, and it's something that I think is really critical for humans to function as well as we do. We can hold off on an immediate reward that's familiar to us in order to flexibly explore alternatives and learn about things that might be better in the long term. And that's something that I think could be driving some of these motivational challenges we see in patients. And so that led me to watch a talk from my biggest collaborator right now, Dr. Vincent Costa, who's now at Emory. He was giving a talk on explore-exploit decision-making, and it kind of just was one of those bell going off moments in science or in your career where somebody was describing a problem that kind of fit exactly the type of question that you were coming to yourself. It was really fun, and it's ended up being this really mutually beneficial collaboration. But it's referred to in the decision-making field as the canonical explore-exploit decision-making trade-off. And the idea, here's a pretty simple framework for this, is that humans and other organisms that face these trade-offs adaptively in day-to-day life are often confronted with these dilemmas. Do I stick with a familiar favorite? I know its reward value. I know what I'm going to get out of it, such as going back to our favorite burger restaurant that we've been to a million times. Or, let's say a friend recommended a new sushi restaurant to you, or it just opened across the block. Do I explore this novel opportunity that's highly uncertain. I don't know anything really about it. If somebody recommended it to me, I have some evidence to go on, but generally speaking, it's a novel and uncertain stimulus option that could end up being my new favorite thing, or could end up being something that I value highly, or way less than the burger at my favorite restaurant. So it's a risk, right? Taking these exploratory decisions. Yet, any of us who frequent restaurants and like to go to a lot of different restaurants are proof in the pudding that this is something we do a lot. We tend to be explorers as species. We tend to be somewhat novelty prone. So what's making us make that decision? We don't have a flux capacitor like Doc Brown did in Back to the Future. We can't prospect out into the future and like deliberately say, I will or I won't like that thing if I try it. We need to rely on computations that can be implemented in our main computing device, the brain, to estimate the potential future value of trying something novel in the short term. And the way that we think people resolve this can be approximated nicely by this computational model we use in the lab called a partially observable Markov decision process model, or a POMDP. I won't bog you down too much in the details. I'll make it very simple. There's basically two free parameters in this model that are driving choice. One parameter is the same one that I said is probably not explaining the whole thing. It's that prior knowledge piece. So specifically, it's called the immediate expected value in our computational model, or the IEV. So if you see me use the acronym IEV, this is what I'm talking about. This is the learned incentive salience of a cue. So if you try it and it's good for you, it goes up. If you try it and it's bad for you, it goes down. It starts out uninformed or naive. So this is just temporal difference reinforcement learning, just classic reward-guided learning signal. Nothing new here. Where our model brings in a unique piece, I think, is in trying to estimate the amount of uncertainty in the environment to approximate the information or new information that can be gained by exploring something novel. And this computational parameter is referred to as the exploration bonus. This is the relative amount of new information you can get from trying an option relative to the options present in the entire set at a given point in time. And this is really high when a new option comes up, motivating exploration, and then as you sample that option, it goes down. If you don't sample the option, it does not go down. So this is not purely perceptual novelty. This is based on the amount of information in the stimulus. It's an important detail there. So I'm not just showing you perceptual habituation in all my files, or all my slides. So just to make this super concrete, if you go back to your favorite burger restaurant, you are somebody who weights the IEV really highly, doesn't really care as much about bonus. If you're somebody who loves to go to new restaurants all the time and explore all sorts of different options, you are somebody who is weighting the bonus parameter highly and who is not weighting the IEV parameter as highly. So that's the general framework we've been using. I'll start off with some mechanistic studies we've done, in particular some studies comparing how humans and non-human primates resolve this dilemma in the lab. We got this nice little rejected cover for a journal. We tried to get this, we paid an artist to make this cover for us for a journal, and they didn't use it, so I figured I'd use it in talks for the rest of my career. Of the Netflix example, it's another explore-exploit dilemma that we face. So I'll go through this as my first story. And the way that we actually study it, or the way that we operationalize the explore-exploit decision-making paradigm in my lab, is this task we refer to as the novelty bandit task. So it's relatively simple. There's a lot of information on the slide here, so I'm going to just sort of walk you through the important bits. It's a three-armed, so three-option, probabilistic reinforcement learning task. Probabilistic meaning that how we're varying reward value is based on probabilities, not based on amplitudes, so not like $10 versus $1. It's 80% versus 50% versus 20%. Each of these options pays you 1 point. Over time, we don't tell the participants that. They have to learn it through trial and error feedback. So over time, they learn which ones are the best for them. But then because we're psychologists and all of our paradigms are trying to trick people at some point, between 5 and 12 trials after they've learned everything and they've learned how to value maximize, we take out one of the options at random, drop in a novel option that we also assign a nominal reward probability, and they now have to decide explicitly, do I explore this new option and maybe find the new best item in the set, or do I exploit the best alternative that was already paying off okay in the past? And obviously that sometimes the alternative is going to be highly valuable, in which case you might be more likely to exploit. Other times it's going to be not so valuable, in which case you're going to be really likely to explore. And all that's sort of randomized throughout the design so that all people are kind of facing explore-exploit trade-offs with different balance between bonus and IEV on each trade-off. And we do it a whole bunch. So this version of it, we had 224 trials, 32 novel stimulus drop-ins happening, and it happened over the course of 4 runs in an fMRI scanner, so about 56 trials per run. So that's the general setup of the task. A variety of other studies I've done today will use this similar paradigm. Some of the aspects might differ, but generally speaking, it's all this framework. I don't see any hands yet, so I'm going to keep going. And by the way, if you have questions, please feel free to ask through it. This is what behavior looks like from a human subject. So the plot you're going to see here, again, you'll see more plots like this later, so I might as well orient you to it now. So in this case, we're plotting on the x-axis how many trials since the novel stimulus popped up. On the y-axis, the probability of making a choice. We have exploring novel, exploiting the best alternative, and making a bad choice. And what you see is that people are kind of novelty prone when the stimulus first pops up. They tend to explore it more often than not. They also learn to exploit. So this line is clearly a positive trend from when the stimulus pops up. They learn to exploit the best alternative. Most importantly, they don't make the bad choice that often. So the chose worst is down there at the bottom. One thing that is kind of an interesting note, chose worst always kind of has a positive line as well. So it kind of trends upwards. That is just embedded within the task is this tendency to maybe explore it initially and get negative reinforcement, so switch back to one of these other two. And then you haven't sampled it that often, so by the time it gets this many trials post-insertion, you might try it out again, just because it's been a while. So we actually have this tendency to, well, that's kind of something that we refer to as random exploration of the space. So you've had some success finding out what's best, and then at some point, stochasticity kicks in and you start choosing random stuff. Yeah, please.
What feedback do they get?
So
they make a choice,
yeah,
and
like a positive 1 or a 0. And the motivational component is key, so I should probably highlight that. We tell them if they accumulate enough plus ones over the course of the task, they get an extra $40. So they all get the $40 at the end. Something I learned in Sook's lab is deception studies can really help motivate your participants. We did that with not telling, yeah, that's another story. But yeah, so they all got the money at the end. We tell them you need to get as many plus ones as possible to get this reward. So you're pretty motivated to do well.
when they choose the worst choice, they still have a 20% chance
Of getting a plus one, exactly.
So sometimes they sample it and they do get.
And they do get, yes, exactly, yeah. So it's not, a lot of reward paradigms would be set up really deterministically for the ease of having clean comparisons between conditions. In this case, what we benefit from is because our value regressors for IEV and bonus are every trial, we can have some trials where you're a little surprised by what the actual feedback is, and it all fits into how the model works out. But yes, that's a good point. You can get a reward for making a bad choice in theory. Very seldom, though. The other point I'll say, I was saying this just over lunch, that some of the most interesting findings that I've published in my lab so far are actually no effects. So we looked at this behavior from a non-human primate, and specifically a rhesus macaque, who was doing the task in a single session, so had been trained to do gaze-based sort of saccade decision-making for juice reward, and then came in and did our task in a single session with a heck of a lot more trials. So I'm cutting it off at 20 trials here, but they did about 400, whereas the human subjects did 200. And the macaque monkeys have a positive line of learning to exploit. It's a little bit noisier, because macaque gaze behavior is noisier than college student undergrads pressing buttons, so you would expect that. But they're similarly novelty prone, to be fair. So if you look at the tendency to explore novel stimuli at the start, it's a roughly equivalent percentage across the non-human primate and the human. And they do learn. So the chose best goes up, chose novel goes down across time, all similarly to what happens in the humans. And none of these were inferentially different. We tested that more precisely by running our POMDP model on both species, so on the human and the non-human primate. And again, like the most impactful thing in our paper was a negative t-test result where we compared the model fit, So this is how well the computational model predicts behavior. It's well above chance for predicting human behavior, and it has a similar effect size for predicting non-human primate behavior. So seems to be a good approximation of how humans and other non-human primates resolve this explore-exploit dilemma. Also, this is just another way of showing the same thing. So the reason the model fits are good is because this line is a negative correlation. Individuals who are doing this task tend to either be more exploitative, down here on the right side where they have a high weighting of the IEV parameter but low bonus, or exploratory up here on the left side where they have a low IEV weighting and a high bonus weighting. That should give you a good insight into the task and how it is similar across species. Mechanistically in the brain, it's implemented by similar neural circuitry as well. So the task that I saw Vinny giving a talk on about this paradigm that made me interested in doing it myself was actually with these ePhys recordings from the non-human primates' amygdala and ventral striatum. And what he found, he was basically just identifying the relative probability that neurons in these regions were encoding the IEV and bonus parameters, so we're actually sensitive to increases or decreases in those parameters. And what he found was there was a significant proportion of neurons in both regions at the time of choice and at the time of outcome that encoded these IEV and bonus parameters, suggesting we're getting somewhat close to something the brain is actually trying to compute to motivate the decision-making behavior. Slightly preferential encoding of IEV in the ventral striatum and slightly preferential encoding of bonus in the amygdala, but in both regions a positive effect. We then put it in a scanner and look at these regions in the human brain, so ventral striatum and the amygdala, and we see what the blood flow to these regions, or the bold signal, looks like as people are making these decisions. And we scale those bold responses as a function of IEV and bonus to see if they're encoded in humans as well. And surprise, surprise, they are. So in both regions, we see positive encoding of the exploration bonus and positive encoding of the IEV. So basically, when IEV is high, bold response goes up. When bonus is high, bold response goes up. Suggesting these are kind of generalized motivational regions. So whether it's the motivation to exploit something familiar, the motivation to explore something novel, amygdala and ventral striatum care a lot about it and increase their blood flow in our case, or increase their spiking in case of the neural populations. We get a slightly more, as we always do, a slightly more complex story out in the prefrontal cortex. So the lateral prefrontal cortex in particular, these are kind of the two, we've now done this paradigm across 4 different independent samples. These results are the ones that are the most consistently found. First off, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, out here on the lateral edge, area 946 in particular, always positively encodes the bonus parameter. So when you're exploring, its bold signal is higher, and negatively encodes the IEV. So when you're exploiting, its bold signal is lower. We think this might be kind of a more domain general control-like effect, so you require more cognitive control to shift and try something new than you do to implement a relatively easy exploitative decision. So explore is high, exploit is low. The thing that we've replicated a couple times now that we still are trying to make hide nor hair of, we actually have a grant under review this spring cycle by the NIH that hopefully gets funded because we're going to probe it more. The lateral frontopolar cortex, area 10, an area that is unique to primates and that is most uniquely evolved in humans relative to other non-human primates. In fact, even in like the rhesus macaque monkeys, one of our best experimental models for this region, there isn't really a good homologue for the lateral frontal pole. We see in our paradigm negative encoding of the bonus parameter here. And other people that have studied explore exploit in the brain, so Nathaniel Daw, Erie Borman down in Davis, a variety of people who do explore exploit have consistently found the frontal pole to encode something about uncertainty or novelty on their tasks when people are exploring. But it's consistently negative in our paradigm, and we're not totally sure why. We have a variety of different ideas. We need to get grant funding to figure it out. We never see it encoding the IEV, importantly. It's always negative to the bonus, doesn't care about IEV. So this is just showing that that's replicated. So this is 40 adults from that original study, 34 TBI patients from a recent data set we collected. I should say this is actually across 49 people because we have 25 healthy controls as well. And then 102 adolescents from a recent study, all performing the task every time, sort of negative encoding of the bonus in frontal pole, positive encoding in lateral DLPFC. So right now, Vinny's got some Utah arrays implanted to try to record from the frontal pole in the monkey to see what's going on. I'm doing MEG increasingly these days to try to get the time course of why it's negative, because in theory, it could be like a post-response undershoot from feedback on the last trial, leading to this dip at around the time of exploration on the next trial. Don't totally know yet. Hopefully MEG will help me resolve it. I got a good computer scientist postdoc I just hired who's going to help me make sense of this stuff, because MEG is harder than task fMRI, I found out. But we're excited to do that. And we're also stimulating it. So one of my students, Ethan Campbell, is demonstrating our TMS setup there. And we're starting to stimulate Brodmann area 10, as well as some of its major inputs, in particular in the dorsomedial PFC, to see if we can perturb, explore, exploit decision-making at different time points. The brain stim one is particularly interesting. This is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's fascinating. So frontal pole has recently emerged as a target for brain stimulation for addiction. So Colleen Hanlon, who was at MUSC, now she's gone over to industry with a company called BrainSway. She's kind of popularized this approach to stimulate right up here in the forehead and treat addiction. So the idea is that what you do is actually dampen craving in these folks. So she's had folks with, I think, cocaine use disorder, nicotine use disorder, a variety of different addictions, receive stimulation to the frontal pole, and then afterwards she'll do something called the cue reactivity paradigm. So this would be if you are cocaine use disorder participant, you would have cues that tend to be associated with cocaine use. If you're a nicotine use disorder participant, you'd have nicotine cues, et cetera. And she finds that those cues have a dampened response. So you don't have as much brain response to the cues anymore. However, frontal pole in her mind is just the medial frontal pole that she's probably hitting, which is involved in value computation, that region that we saw at that initial paper on value-based decision-making with the auction task. But this lateral frontal pole, which for anybody who's done TMS, it's kind of like taking a sledgehammer to a part of the brain. You're definitely going to be getting some lateral frontal polar stimulation when you stimulate here. And in our view, what that could be perturbing as well is not only reactivity to the familiar cues, but potentially affecting your flexibility with finding alternative outcomes for your actions. So I'm not going to go back to smoking the cigarette. I'm going to go and chew a pack of gum because I need an alternative output for that craving. Flexibly choosing alternatives is something that we've now found is encoded in this frontopolar region. And so what we want to do is kind of sort out what is the actual mechanism of this intervention. And every study that's done it has only stimulated the one target. They haven't had a comparison target. So we're doing that. We have a comparison target, which is right in the dorsal medial PFC in an area that connects to the frontal pole. And then we're stimulating frontal pole exactly where Colleen Hanlon's doing. We have some pilot data here just from that DACC targeting. And we find that we affect behavioral model fit overall, not IEV or bonus in particular. It's only N equals 10 people. I'm not totally ready to go to press yet with it. We're going to collect some more people first. But the key thing we're finding is that by stimulating up here, we're getting some effects in the frontal polar cortex that are related to value computation that we'll be exploring more in depth soon if we get this funding. Vinny is using DREADS to do an analogous stimulation in the non-human primate to see that you can actually ramp up novelty seeking by stimulating the circuit. So again, we're sort of doing this cross-species comparison to get mechanistic insights I can't get in humans, in the monkey, and then some real-world insight to a drug use stimulation that people are actually using in clinical settings from humans that I can get that he can't get. So it's been a really nice collaboration. I said there was going to be abrupt transitions between sections. So that's mechanistic studies. That's what we've been doing in the lab. Next up, patient apathy. So going back to patient studies and why I got into this area in the first place. One of the key things, and I sort of alluded to it a little bit there talking about that addiction-based neurostimulation method, is the question of apathy then becomes, is this related to a blunted ability to learn to exploit familiar rewards? So are they unable to learn based on the sort of incentive salience of familiar rewards? Or are individuals who develop apathy unable to prospectively value novel or uncertain choice options? So if you have an acquired injury that causes a motivational deficit, is it that you have a blanket reward-guided learning impairment? Or you have a hard time prospecting out in the future to see how valuable it might be to explore something novel? So we collected a good group of traumatic brain injury subjects and non-brain injured controls. This was mild to moderate brain injury for folks that do TBI work. So everybody had a loss of consciousness reported when we surveyed them, and post-traumatic amnesia, indicative of a mild TBI. Some folks were up to hours. One was actually out for an entire week. So mostly mild to moderate. One individual who was in the severe TBI range. All of them had not all of them, a significant percentage of them had increased apathy after the injury. So higher apathy compared to a matched control group. We then had them perform our novelty bandit task. So again, pretty similar experimental setup to what I've done before, again in an fMRI context. They did 2 tasks in the scanner this time. So we actually also had them do, a collaborator on this work, Masood Hussain, has this effort-based decision-making paradigm that we also had them do, mainly because this is kind of the gold standard for neuroimaging of apathy and neurological disorders. To just give you a quick flavor for how it works, you have this grip dynamometer that you're asked to squeeze as hard as you possibly can for 14 seconds. It's alarmingly hard to squeeze something as hard as you can for 14 seconds. I didn't like doing it myself. So you squeeze it as hard as you can for 14 seconds, and then we have you make a series of effort-value trade-off decisions. So you'd have to exert 100% of that effort to get 8 points, 80% of that effort to get 13 points. And we sort of sample that trade-off between how much effort is there versus how much reward you might get in return. And what we end up being able to measure with this is how much you devalue the rewards based on the physical effort required to obtain them. So how much less likely you are to think fondly of a sandwich that's a 6-kilometer walk from here because it's too far to walk. So that's kind of what we're getting at here. And this is something that's been related to apathy in Parkinson's disease before. It's been related to apathy in healthy volunteers before. It's just a continuous measure that helps to assay apathy. And so we're expecting it to be predictive of apathy as well. So we did both these tasks in an fMRI environment in TBI and control. So for the novelty bandit paradigm, we see that our TBI patients and controls are a little bit older and notably more exploitative. So actually I have a grant right now on aging where we're kind of curious about whether or not we're going to see increased exploitation behavior in old age. This sample happens to be one of the oldest ones we collected, and it's about equal probable to explore or exploit when the stimuli first pop up, which is sort of supportive of what we're looking at now in that study. And then we look at the contrast between bonus and IEV encoding, and we have this really distributed sort of task-positive increases in activation around the frontoparietal network and visual areas, as well as sort of salience regions like the insula and the dorsal anterior cingulate, and deactivation of areas that can be involved in more habitual or rote behaviors like primary motor regions and some subcortical regions as well. On the effort task, we have a really nice value-effort trade-off curve. So this is basically just showing that as the effort level increases, you require more value to be present, to say yes, you agree with the offer. And we have a similar sort of diagram here of the value effort trade-off in the brain with just lots of regions that are involved in task positive encoding kind of having a negative deflection around the time of choice in this value effort trade-off, and several other areas having positive activation, in particular ventromedial prefrontal cortex has a really nice positive encoding of the value effort trade-off. So we're basically seeing, are these brain responses and behavioral responses correlated with apathy or scaling with apathy in our TBI cohort, to try to get an idea for what mechanisms in their decision-making profiles are different. What we found is that there was this really big effect for a difference between explore and exploit and apathy in TBI that was not present in control. So individuals with higher apathy who had had a brain injury were more negative when we calculated this difference score. So somebody down here in the bottom right with apathy and a traumatic brain injury would be really highly weighting the immediate value of exploiting something familiar and really not valuing the bonus of exploring something novel. So that shift up to having a more exploitative group might have been driven by a lot of these higher apathy folks with TBI in this sample. With effort-based discounting of rewards here on the y-axis, we see a negative relationship that's a main effect. It's not an interaction, so here it's consistent across TBI and control, where there's a negative slope between effort-based discounting and apathy. So again, the people down here on the right more physical effort causes them to devalue the stimulus more. And lastly, an important note, those are not related to each other. So that prospective valuation difference is related to apathy, but it's not related to effort-based discounting, which is related to apathy. So these kind of seem like independent drivers of amotivation, one that's unique to TBI and one that's just a general marker of apathy. The brain data tells us the same thing. It's a complicated figure, so I'm just going to walk through the last bit of it slowly. So some of those task-positive regions that I mentioned that seem to be encoding the bonus more highly and the IEV more negatively, in particular dorsolateral PFC, lateral intraparietal area, as well as CRUS1 and CRUS2 of the cerebellum, which are regions that are highly connected to the frontoparietal network. These regions show reduced activation as a function of bonus in the more apathetic folks. So these areas that are always positive to the bonus and negative to the IEV when you're making these explore-exploit trade-off choices seem to be dampened in the more apathetic TBI participants, but not in controls. So this is a significant interaction between group and apathy. We have a significant main effect in our dorsolateral striatum, so it's actually the putamen bilaterally, where individuals with TBI are demonstrating blunted encoding of those effort value trade-offs in the dorsolateral striatum, the putamen. And when we look at the correlations between those bold parameter estimates and the apathy scores, again, there's like a main effect similar to the behavior that doesn't appear as an interaction between the dorsolateral striatal encoding of effort and apathy. So across both controls and TBI, there's a general trend towards a negative relationship. Whereas on the explore-exploit trade-off, there's this unique relationship in TBI. So both the behavior and the imaging are telling us a convergent story here, which is that sort of blunted encoding of the bonus parameter in these frontoparietal cerebellar networks seems to be driving enhanced stickiness or reduced exploration of the novel options in apathetic TBI patients. And then effort-based discounting is common across apathy, regardless of if you have an injury or not. Next up. So I said three discrete stories. Last one I'll talk about today, how are we doing on time? Do I have a little bit of time left? Okay. I'll walk you through this one in my last few minutes here. So something I've gotten really interested recently is kind of the rise and fall of exploratory ability over the lifespan. So individuals kind of come into this world super novelty prone, exploring way too much, like getting way too many germs out there in the world. And then at some point, we start to become more like goal-directed and adaptive with our exploration. And then later in life, like I said, we're kind of interested in whether or not people might become more sticky. So I have a collaborative CIHR project with these two folks, Nathan Sprang and Gary Turner. Nathan's at McGill, Gary's at York. And we're really interested in testing this hypothesis they laid out in this recent TICS paper, that as folks get into old age, they might become more exploitative. That's a story that I can answer maybe 5 years from now. First up, I'll tell you what we've just finished collecting Wave 1 data on, which is an adolescent imaging study. And the thing with adolescence and exploration is if you ask a developmental scientist, they will tell you how important exploration is. Like, you need to make mistakes, you need to get out and see the world, you need to do stuff to find out who you really are. If you talk to an addiction scientist or a clinical psychologist, there's a good chance they might start to point towards how some of this increased risk-taking or exploration might be related to the onset of behavioral and mental health challenges that tend to peak in adolescence. So things like substance addiction that can really emerge when you have heightened risk-taking and exploration and reduced stickiness and exploitation. So it's important developmentally, but it kind of predisposes you to maybe having a negative outcome if you don't go about it the right way. So that's what we're really curious about in the lab, is what is differentiating those two profiles. One of them matures, goes on to have a healthy developing brain. The other one gets locked into a pattern of behavior and maybe never gets out of it. So we've just completed Wave 1 of collection on the learning and exploration and adolescence study. We're ready to sort of write up the results from our Wave 1. This is an accelerated longitudinal project, so the kids will be coming back 2 more times. And I say kids, but this is actually adolescence and early adulthood, so it's 13 to 21 years old at Wave 1. They'll come back 2 more times, and we'll eventually be able to chart that 13 to 24-year-old age window with like accelerated longitudinal growth curve modeling type approaches. For now, I just have the cross-sectional data from Wave 1 to talk about. We use our standard 3-arm bandit paradigm. The only caveat is now we have a loss component. So anybody who studied adolescence and reward might have seen that there's a lot of people out there that are really focused on the differentiation between reward and loss, and how there might be kind of a reduced differentiation between those two in adolescence, where they're totally fine at learning from reward, but they're not quite as good at learning from negative reinforcement. I've seen that. I've also seen the complete opposite findings. So we were like, we got to get some data on that and sort it out. So we have both versions in the paradigm, and basically how it works is that on the first half of each fMRI run, you're trying to accumulate points through rewards. Halfway through, we flip the reward environment and change all the stimuli. So you're forced to start learning all over again. And now you're learning to try to minimize losses. And we did it very intentionally this way because we wanted people to be motivated by the losses and the rewards in a similar extent. So you accumulate points at time 1 or block 1. And then once we flip it to losses, you're losing points that you just earned. So you actually care. And I designed it, and it still annoyed me when I started losing points. So it was a salient motivator. Interestingly, we have this kind of flip-flop that happens with our data. So the loss environment now looks like the data we collected in our first study, where people are more exploratory than exploitative. The win context, now that we have this valence manipulation, seems to be more like the older folks, where there's a bit more sticky decision-making going on. The key contrast, though, is clearly valence is affecting exploration. You are more motivated to explore novel opportunities to get away from something bad for you than you are to potentially find something beneficial for you. Computationally, this fits as well. So our POMDP model fit was slightly better in the win context, but the thing I mainly want to point out here is these are both almost identical to the adults that we collected before. So adolescents are doing the task perfectly fine, just as well as our adult participants did. Importantly, when we look at the IEV and bonus parameter weightings as a function of loss versus win, IEV goes slightly up to rewards. Not that surprising. You're better able to learn to exploit rewards than you are to learn to exploit non-reward in a loss context. The biggest effect size I've seen since opening my lab, though, is that you have a much higher bonus weighting in the loss context than the win context. Once those losses are present in the environment, you're scrambling to find something, even if you have something that seems like a safe bet in your environment already. When we look at that model fit across age, doesn't really differ, so it fits similarly well across age. It's, potentially trending if 0.1 is a trend, but no, there's no age relationship between POMDP model fit. There is a slight valence effect on the motivation to exploit, so the IEV weighting, and just in case you're not used to seeing age in months, remember this is 13 to 21 years old. There's a valence effect in the IEV parameter. You weight the IEV more highly in win relative to loss, but it does not vary as a function of age. The cool finding, sort of aim 1 of the grant, the thing that we were hoping worked, did. There's a main effective age on the bonus weighting. So as these adolescents are going up to sort of early adulthood, we see an enhanced weighting of that exploration bonus parameter. In particular, it seems more marked in the win relative to the loss context. I should say there's no interaction, though. So it's a main effect of valence, the bonus weighting is higher in loss, and of age. It's positively scaling with age across the sample. What about the brain? There's age-dependent changes in encoding of the IEV in the medial prefrontal cortex. So this is that, we're sort of taking it back home to the first region I talked about where the lesions were in my first study. This region seems to scale up its encoding of IEV as a function of age in adolescence. The learning, in theory, should be getting better, but behaviorally, that wasn't found. Just the brain signals getting better. Most importantly, this sort of thing I'll wrap up with, that lateral frontal polar cortex thing that we found and that we found across 3 studies gets more negative between adolescent and emerging adulthood. So whatever encoding of the bonus parameter is happening there that's leading to this negative deflection at the time of choice seems to be coming online as you're going from adolescence through emerging adulthood, at the same time that we're seeing that parameter drive behavior more from adolescence through emerging adulthood. That ability to prospect and think out in the future, computing the bonus, using it to guide your exploration, seems to be something that's coming online from adolescence through emerging adulthood. Because we're a little short on time and I want to have time for questions, I'll wrap up quickly here. We did look at alcohol use with exploration in a previous study. found that folks with alcohol use disorder are more likely to explore alcohol cues. And we also find a relationship to alcohol use severity in our folks who are pretty bad at making bonus-guided decisions. This is one of the big questions we're going to have longitudinally, is using bonus maturation to predict alcohol use challenges and change across time. Cross-sectionally, it's starting to pop up already, though, which is promising. And there's no relationship with IEV or bonus in the loss valence. But that's sort of a story that we're not totally ready to market yet. Summary, so we've been exploring in the lab novelty-directed exploration circuitry in frontoparietal, frontostriatal, and frontopolar regions. We've been looking at patient amotivation, so when motivation is disrupted, and we suggest that it might be more related to prospective rather than retrospective evaluation. And then novelty-directed exploration seems to increase in loss relative to win contexts and seems to emerge as a result of this frontopolar maturation from adolescence through emerging adulthood. Lastly, stay tuned for, we'll be doing like I said, the alcohol use disorder prediction and other substances. A lot of these adolescents are using just super high levels of cannabis. I think it's kind of not surprising because we legalized it relatively recently, but a lot of them use cannabis every day and very few of them actually drink, so it might end up being a cannabis use disorder study by the end of it. But we're going to look for substance use prediction through the maturation of these circuits over time. Longitudinal growth curve models to really settle how it should mature in normative development. And then young-old comparisons once we get the data from that collaboration with folks up in Canada. And I think that's it. Thank you to all the people that I collaborate with and my funders, and to you all for being here. Any questions? I think we got a couple minutes left. Yes.
Good question. So performance in your task, where you have to choose the optimal one or the novel one and so on, presumably it's related to things like how much you like the reward, how much you don't dislike the non-reward,
Right.
and your perception of what the probabilities are for these various choices.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I'm wondering, are people equally good at, I mean, is the salience or the value of the reward versus non-reward, their relative
Right.
perception of the relative chances for getting these rewards, does that change with age, for example?
Yeah. So I mean, that would. So the question was about, I guess, individual differences. And sorry, I'm just repeating for them, whoever's hearing me over the mic. Age-related differences or other individual difference factors that might contribute to sort of the baseline motivation. Is that a fair? Is that? Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's going to vary. Is what I'm hoping for, because the degree of variance might be what we end up being able to use as predictive for other things. What I will say, one of the things that Sook's mentioned to me a few times, and that I'm really interested in getting into in our data, is we have a lot of data on early adversity and early socioeconomic status as these folks were really young. And I would be really curious about whether the volatility or instability of one's reward environment, or poverty of one's reward environment early on, would be predictive of a certain ability to learn immediate expected value, but maybe perhaps not take the time to prospect out in the future and maybe sort of be more sticky in our decision-making paradigm. So some of those individual factors that might shape the motivations here are really one of the things that I think will make it interesting for us, because it'll really help us to predict outcomes that matter in day-to-day life. So I think yes, and I hope it has some signal, just not noise there, is what I'll say. Yeah.
You mentioned, like, towards when you're talking about the ontology, it's like you introduce risk, but then for the POMD models, you still count that as like a bonus assessment, right? So
Yes.
do you think there's value in like differentiating?
Yeah.
Maybe adding a tertiary term for risk assessment versus how you value a bonus?
Okay, so yeah, risk assessment. So the question was about risk assessment and how that's not really reflected in our POMDP. So what I'll say is risk is not one that I've focused on as much, because there's a lot of folks out there that have done like balloon analog reasoning tasks and like other sort of risky decision-making tasks in adolescence. So what we're hoping for here is kind of to have relatively unique stuff that we're going after that's not necessarily out there yet. So I'll see if what I'm about to say is interesting to you, and then this will tell me whether this is the best model to compare the POMDP to. So we have another model it's a novelty RL model. So the basic idea with this one is it's a standard temporal difference RL model so like the IV parameter. But we have these bonus sort of similar sort of amplitude bonus spikes that come online when a novel stimulus pops up. And it doesn't differ by what's in the current environment. It doesn't differ by anything. It's kind of like a uninformed version of our bonus. But if somebody's really making a lot of decisions to explore at the first time point, no matter what the current reward environment is, that could potentially be more as like what we call random exploration in the field, where it's more like the dog chasing a squirrel type of exploration, like novel stimulus pops up, go for it. And it's almost, if you were to just fit a simple linear effects or linear mixed effects model to it, it would kind of be the intercept. When the first thing comes up, what's your probability of choosing it? So we're going to kind of compare and contrast those two approaches of modeling it to see information-based exploration, which the bonus is getting, and that's what we wanted to improve, which is. But we're also, on the flip side, kind of expecting that type of exploration where it's purely perceptual novelty driven to be maybe higher in early adolescence, if anything, or perhaps just a flat line and not maturing across age. So that's one parameter that kind of gets at that a little bit that we're assessing. We certainly have like questionnaire-based measures from the parent that relate to risky behavior in school settings and those kinds of things that we could get at that a little bit, but yeah, we're not getting at risk per se, but there's lots of computational things that we need to pull out still. Hopefully that's enough.
Yeah.
To answer your question. Okay, cool. Thank you. I don't know whose hand.
Okay, Megan Segal, then David.
Megan.
So you kind of touched on this. So in the task that you're using, everyone sort of starts at the same level of probability, right? Of
Yes.
rating.
Yeah.
Have you thought about having people start at like a net positive versus a net loss? And
Right.
then having those?
Yeah, so the question was about the starting point, whether if you're starting from a place of abundance or a place of sort of losing points. So that's something that I think we're bound to get a reviewer force us to do that experiment. So we elected to have this consistent ordering of our events so that we didn't need to worry about an allotment or changing what the magnitudes of rewards were or losses were in our study. And you just had 0 points, you earn some points, and then you lose some amount of those points. And so the rewards are salient because you're getting them, and the losses are salient because you're losing points you have. Options for doing that type of paradigm that would be different and would enable you to flip the order would be to have like a coin allotment or a point allotment up front, and then you might lose some of those initially, but then gain some back during the reward period. We didn't elect to do that initially because we were worried that that might sort of skew how salient the stimuli were, like you hadn't really earned them initially, so you might not care as much about them. But we are bound to have the question about order effects in our study. So even just for like an experimental design standpoint, I might have to have a better answer for that for you next time I see you. But we know we haven't manipulated it, but it's something that, I mean, even related to like the socioeconomic status thing I mentioned earlier, like if you're from a place where you don't have a lot of rewards, these mean a lot more to you. It's always been the issue with temporal discounting literature where it's like would you take $50 today or $100 in a year, that if you have somebody come in from low SES, they're going to take the $50 today because it's money in hand. So there's definitely like more salient kind of environmental reward factors that'll change. But as far as experimentally manipulating it, we haven't fully thought through how to do it yet, but we feel like we need to because reviewers are going to ask us to anyways. So I might have an experimental version of that answer soon.
Mine's sort of a three-step question.
Oh, okay.
Initially, you said that like some exploration is normal with ontogeny, and we need to get there for normal development, but too much may predispose individuals to super risky things that may put them down the wrong track, like addiction or
Right,
something like that.
right.
When you do this paradigm with the addicts, what do they do?
Yeah, so that's been done. It hasn't been done, so we think our paradigm's the best one, so as everybody does. But there's lots of explore-exploit paradigms, and some of the other ones have been done in folks who have active addiction. One of the consistent findings tends to be things that seem more related to random exploration, as I've alluded to so far. Like one of them, for example, is a parameter called the inverse temperature, which is just how stochastic choice is across the options in the state, regardless of whether it's a good or a bad thing to be exploring, but just how variable your options are seems to vary. As I think that's like a methamphetamine use disorder study that did that. So it's been looked at. The one thing I'll say, the only time we did do it, that I glossed over quickly, had kind of a biased stimulus set to encourage the exploration. So we had individuals with alcohol use disorder who were seeing either alcohol cues or non-alcoholic beverage cues in the same novelty bandit I already described. We called them hazardous drinkers to be safe because a lot of them had the criteria for an alcohol use disorder, then lost it when they came in for the study, so we had to go with this label, but effectively, these all had lifetime alcohol use disorder. And what we found was an enhanced motivation to explore it. So the bonus weighting, basically how much value they saw in exploring alcohol cues, was higher, and then the non-alcohol cues was actually more negative, and the hazardous drinkers related to something called the P3A, which is like a novelty orienting EEG response. So it suggests that there's something about like the salience of these cues that makes you overvalue how good they might be.
So addicts in your study were more explorative?
In this one, yes. It's a cue-specific difference in an adult with an established addiction. I think the key with adolescents is a lot of these kids have not really done much of anything yet or have not drank at all yet. And what we're really interested in seeing is just sort of more generalized maturation of exploration circuitry, not to the cues themselves, but just generally. How does that predispose? It's kind of a different question.
I know that you're really interested in the brain and what's going on with the brain.
Yeah.
But many people are saying that the gut is the new brain. And
Right.
I just wonder, like with like these new drugs that are on the market, like Ozempic.
Oh, yeah.
that
Yeah.
have impacts on addiction.
Yes.
I wonder if you looked at people who were taking Ozempic, which is supposed to dampen your overall
Yeah.
desire for bad shit.
Yeah.
Whether it's food or
Yeah.
drugs or sex or video games or whatever.
Yeah.
What would they do in your paradigm? What would
Yeah.
you predict?
I want to do that study. I've actually talked to people about doing that study. The main reason I'm getting at it is, so I have a colleague in New Mexico, Jim Kavanaugh, who's really interested in the difference between hedonic salience versus just kind of reward-based learning and how those two might differ. So kind of similar to Kent Berridge's framework of wanting and liking and how those can dissociate. So you can have people who really, really like a drug and really want it, and then they kind of stop liking it so much, but they still want it. And there's this differentiation between the value seeking. And we're really curious about whether or not, because that Ozempic clearly dampens the wanting response. I'm curious about whether or not it also dampens a global liking response to rewards more generally. Because I think that's something that could be a heretofore unknown side effect. I'm giving away this idea for free, but it's something I want to do, and I don't have the time to do it right now.
But do you think Ozempic would make them be more exploitative and less explorative?
Totally, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to
No. I think it's entirely possible, and I think my guess is that if you had some neural signature of how salient the information was, even when you're learning to exploit it, it would be just maybe dampened across the board. So they just don't have as much of a motivational salience, the cues, anymore. That's my idea. But yeah, I would. Somebody's got to run that study.
So my question is about prospect theory, and
Right.
because I guess it's sort of like Megan's question about ordering, because you're in a gain frame
Yeah.
for the first part, and then you switch it to a loss frame. So the data make total sense. that
Yeah.
In the loss frame, they're just more risky.
Right.
Um,
Right.
So I guess I'm trying to wonder what do we know more than just
Like the
losses
standard
too
loss
large?
aversion. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's entirely possible. So the sort of novel thing here is I think we have kind of a computational framework to understand it a little bit better and then probe it in the brain, and we're looking at it across maturation. But yeah, totally, that was cited in the grant as a potential reason to look at this, because prospect theory expects that you would be averse to losses more so than you would be motivated to seek out the gains. So in theory, you should be really trying hard to get the best option and get away from any losses in the loss context. So yeah, it's kind of a replication of the loss aversion effect in a new context. So
Right, but on top of that, there's the idea that in the area of losses, people are more risk-seeking.
right,
They'll take more risk.
Right.
So, which should map on exactly.
should
to your
map onto what
bonus
we're showing.
parameter.
Yeah, totally.
You should be able to see the bonus parameter change as you frame, which is sort of what you're finding. So I'm just trying to map this on.
Yeah.
Because we have this theory of prospect theory, and it seems to overlap with what you're saying, but
Right.
the language is slightly different.
I think in prospect theory, the idea of risk or like something that is uncertain is kind of just this ethereal construct, like it's an idea about what you might be doing. Here we're trying to like formalize it to a certain extent. We're trying to say like, what is the brain computing to decide to go after that novel stimulus? And the bonus is our best approximation for it. By 5 years, it'll probably be something different, or that'll be wrong. But it's at least pushing us towards like a formal framework for what the computation is that's driving you to seek out that novel stimulus. And risk, I mean, risk is a much more loaded term, right? Like it necessitates that by doing this thing, you are making this strong decision that I don't want this immediate reward. I really want to explore that novel thing. And that might be some of what bonus gets, but I think it also potentially gets slightly more precisely at what's happening when you're exploring. And I don't think it's necessarily bad to replicate things that should happen in the field in these studies where we're also collecting all these adolescents and we're really predictive of longitudinal development and everything, because it helps us to ground any intuitions we see about how it matures in something that we can trust. Like prospect theory says this, now when we formalize it in this POM-DP framework mathematically, this is what we're suggesting is going to happen, and it happens, and that changes over development. So I think it can all work, right?
I'm thinking about it more as the impact of framing, because like as you age,
Right.
your frame also changes, right? Early on, you're really thinking about gains, and
Right.
later on in your life, maybe you're thinking about
Worried
losses.
more about losses,
And
yeah.
so when you're focused on losses, you're going to behave a certain way that's different than when you're focused on gain.
Yes, yeah.
And like in your paradigm, you're at least before you did the switching one,
Yeah.
the first paradigm, it's all about gains.
Yes.
You only are gaining points, and so that's going to push people to be slightly risk averse.
Yes, yeah.
So
Well, if anything, if risk is associated with exploration, then we actually have more risky decision making in the gain-only version. Because people were probably exploring en masse less in the second version of it. Yeah, I don't know. We should talk. Was there another question, or is this the? There's one more down here.
yeah, we can chat after.
We should talk more after, because I think I want to.
That's the last one, then we're going to go up to the third floor anyway.
Oh, great.
Second.
Second, sorry. Second.
Cool. All right.
We've got one more there, I think. Was there one more question?
Yeah, Zoe.
Yes. Yeah.
One, yeah.
I can wait till the reception.
No, go.
No, please.
I'm curious, especially if you're looking at adolescent, whether you think the reward would be different if you look at like social reward, something like that.
Yeah. That's actually in my job application materials that I decided the next step was going to be doing that. I haven't had time to do it yet. Totally. So I'd be really interested to do like explore, exploit in the wild type paradigms, like see how people sort of make these decisions adaptively when they're choosing social interaction partners or food items or whatever in a more naturalistic way. That's kind of what, when I worked with Sook, that was one of the things I really prioritized. So getting back to that would be cool. We just haven't, it's harder to put in the scanner, and we've had this task that's working for us that monkeys can also do, so the NIH likes that, so we've been focusing on that. But in theory, yes, that those should be particularly salient rewards, and adolescents should be particularly motivated by them, and it would be really cool to look at that. So let's do that study at some point.
All right, well, Jeremy, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Great questions. Thank you.